Hello friends. Welcome to Blurred TV. Today we will discuss about wireless device radiation and health. What unseen wireless radiation is doing to your health. So let's start. Wireless device radiation and heat. The antennas contained in mobile phones, including smartphones, emit radio frequency, RF, radiation, non-ionizing, radio waves, such as microwaves. The parts of the head or body nearest to the antenna can absorb this energy and convert it to heat. Since at least the 1990s, scientists have researched whether the now ubiquitous radiation associated with mobile phone antennas or cell phone towers is affecting human health. Mobile phone networks use various bands of RF frequency, some of which overlap with the microwave range. Other digital wireless systems, such as data communication networks, produce similar radiation. In response to public concern, the World Health Organization established the International EMF Project in 1996 to assess the scientific evidence of possible health effects of EMF in the frequency range from 0 to 300 GHz. They have stated that although extensive research has been conducted into possible health effects of exposure to many parts of the frequency spectrum, all reviews conducted so far have indicated that, as long as exposures are below the limits recommended in the ICNIRP 1998 EMF guidelines, which cover the full frequency range from 0 to 300 GHz, such exposures do not produce any known adverse health effect. In 2011, International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, an agency of the World Health Organization, classified wireless radiation as Group 2B, possibly carcinogenic. That means that there could be some risk of carcinogenicity, so additional research into the long-term heavy use of wireless devices needs to be conducted. The WHO states that a large number of studies have been performed over the last 2 decades to assess whether mobile phones pose a potential health risk. To date, no adverse health effects have been established as being caused by mobile phone use. International guidelines on exposure levels to microwave frequency EMFs such as ICNIRP limit the power levels of wireless devices, and it is uncommon for wireless devices to exceed the guidelines. These guidelines only take into account thermal effects, as non-thermal effects have not been conclusively demonstrated. The official stance of the British Health Protection Agency, HPA, is that here is no consistent evidence to date that Wi-Fi and WLANs adversely affect the health of the general population, but also that it is a sensible precautionary approach to keep the situation under ongoing review. In a 2018 statement, the FDA said that the current safety limits are set to include a 50-fold safety margin from observed effects of radio frequency energy exposure. Mobile phones. A mobile phone connects to the telephone network by radio waves exchanged with a local antenna and automated transceiver called a cellular base station, cell site or cell tower. The service area served by each provider is divided into small geographical areas called cells, and all the phones in a cell communicate with that cell's antenna. Both the phone and the tower have radio transmitters which communicate with each other. Since in a cellular network the same radio channels are reused every few cells, cellular networks use low-power transmitters to avoid radio waves from one cell spilling over and interfering with a nearby cell using the same frequencies. Mobile phones are limited to an effective isotropic radiated power (EIRP) output of 3 watts. And the network continuously adjusts the phone transmitter to the lowest power consistent with good signal quality, reducing it to as low as 1 mW when near the cell tower. Tower channel transmitters usually have an EIRP power output of around 50 watts. Even when it is not being used, unless it is turned off. A mobile phone periodically emits radio signals on its control channel to keep contact with its cell tower and for functions like handing off the phone to another tower if the user crosses into another cell. When the user is making a call, the phone transmits a signal on a second channel which carries the user's voice. Existing 2G, 3G, and 4G networks use frequencies in the UHF or low microwave bands, 600 MHz to 3.5 GHz. Many household wireless devices such as Wi-Fi networks, garage door openers, and baby monitors use other frequencies in this same frequency range. Radio waves decrease rapidly in intensity by the inverse square of distance as they spread out from a transmitting antenna. So the phone transmitter, which is held close to the user's face when talking, is a much greater source of human exposure than the tower transmitter, which is typically at least hundreds of meters away from the user. A user can reduce their exposure by using a headset and keeping the phone itself farther away from their body. Next generation 5G cellular networks, which began deploying in 2019, use higher frequencies in or near the millimeter wave band, 24 to 52 GHz. Millimeter waves are absorbed by atmospheric gases, so 5G networks will use smaller cells than previous cellular networks. About the size of a city block. Instead of a cell tower, each cell will use an array of multiple small antennas mounted on existing buildings and utility poles. In general, millimeter waves penetrate less deeply into biological tissue than microwaves, and are mainly absorbed within the first centimeter of the body surface. Cordless phones. The HPA also says that due to the mobile phone's adaptive power ability, a DECT cordless phone's radiation could actually exceed the radiation of a mobile phone. The HPA explains that while the DECT cordless phone's radiation has an average output power of 10 milliwatts, it is actually in the form of 100 bursts per second of 250 milliwatts. A strength comparable to some mobile phones. Wireless networking. Most wireless LAN equipment is designed to work within predefined standards. Wireless access points are also often close to people. But the drop-off in power over distance is fast, following the inverse square law. However, wireless laptops are typically used close to people. Wi-Fi had been anecdotally linked to electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but research into electromagnetic hypersensitivity has found no systematic evidence supporting claims made by sufferers. Users of wireless networking devices are typically exposed for much longer periods than for mobile phones, and the strength of wireless devices is not significantly less. Whereas a universal mobile telecommunications system (UMTS) phone can range from 21 dBm, 125 milliwatts, for power class 4 to 33 dBm, 2W, for power class 1. A wireless router can range from a typical 15 dBm, 30 milliwatts, strength to 27 dBm, 500 milliwatts, on the high end. However, wireless routers are typically located significantly farther away from users' heads than a phone the user is handling, resulting in far less exposure overall. The Health Protection Agency, HPA, says that if a person spends 1 year in a location with a Wi-Fi hotspot, they will receive the same dose of radio waves as if they had made a 20-minute call on a mobile phone. The HPA's position is that radio frequency, RF, exposures from Wi-Fi are likely to be lower than those from mobile phones. It also saw no reason why schools and others should not use Wi-Fi equipment. In October 2007, the HPA launched a new, systematic, study into the effects of Wi-Fi networks on behalf of the UK government, in order to calm fears that had appeared in the media in a recent period up to that time. Michael Clark of the HPA says published research on mobile phones and masts does not add up to an indictment of Wi-Fi blood-brain barrier. A 2010 review stated that the balance of experimental evidence does not support an effect of non-thermal radio frequency fields on the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, but noted that research on low-frequency effects and effects in humans was sparse. A 2012 study of low-frequency radiation on humans found no evidence for acute effects of short-term mobile phone radiation on cerebral blood flow. Cancer. There is no known way in which radio-frequency radiation, in contrast to ionizing radiation, affects DNA and causes cancer. And laboratory research has found no good evidence of any such effect in animal studies. In 2011, the IARC, a World Health Organization working group, classified mobile phone use as possibly carcinogenic to humans. The IARC summed up their conclusion with, "The human epidemiological evidence was mixed." Several small early case control studies were considered to be largely uninformative. A large cohort study showed no increase in risk of relevant tumors. But it lacked information on level of mobile phone use, and there were several potential sources of misclassification of exposure. The bulk of evidence came from reports of the INTERPHONE study. A very large international, multi-center case control study and a separate large case control study from Sweden on gliomas and meningiomas of the brain and acoustic neuromas. While affected by selection bias and information bias to varying degrees, these studies showed an association between glioma and acoustic neuroma and mobile phone use. Specifically in people with highest cumulative use of mobile phones, in people who had used mobile phones on the same side of the head as that on which their tumor developed. And in people whose tumor was in the temporal lobe of the brain, the area of the brain that is most exposed to RF radiation when a wireless phone is used at the ear. The CDC states that no scientific evidence definitively answers whether mobile phone use causes cancer. In a 2018 statement, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration said that the current safety limits are set to include a 50-fold safety margin from observed effects of radiofrequency energy exposure. On 1 November 2018, the U.S. National Toxicology Program published the final version, after peer review that was performed through March 2018, of its eagerly anticipated study using rats and mice. Conducted over some 10 years. This report concludes after the review with an updated statement that there is clear evidence that male rats exposed to high levels of radiofrequency radiation, RFR, like that used in 2G and 3G cell phones, developed cancerous heart tumors. There was also some evidence of tumors in the brain and adrenal gland of exposed male rats. For female rats, and male and female mice, the evidence was equivocal as to whether cancers observed were associated with exposure to RFR. An early analysis of preliminary results issued by the National Toxicology Program had indicated that due to such issues as the inconsistent appearances of signals for harm within and across species, and the increased chances of false positives due to the multiplicity of tests, the positive results seen are more likely due to random chance. The full results of the study were released for peer review in February 2018. Safety standards and licensing. To protect the population living around base stations and users of mobile handsets, governments and regulatory bodies adopt safety standards, which translate to limits on exposure levels below a certain value. There are many proposed national and international standards, but that of the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP, is the most respected one, and has been adopted so far by more than 80 countries. ICNIRP proposes two safety levels, one for occupational exposure, another one for the general population. Currently there are efforts underway to harmonize the different standards in existence. Radio base licensing procedures have been established in the majority of urban spaces regulated either at municipal, county, provincial, state or national level. Mobile telephone service providers are, in many regions, required to obtain construction licenses, provide certification of antenna emission levels and assure compliance to ICNIRP standards and/or to other environmental legislation. Many governmental bodies also require that competing telecommunication companies try to achieve sharing of towers so as to decrease environmental and cosmetic impact. This issue is an influential factor of rejection of installation of new antennas and towers in communities. If you like our video, so please press the like button and comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to get the latest update of our videos.